A missing child, a bomb disguised as a Christmas gift, a civil rights era Klan murderer brought to justice. Join David Ridgen as he and victims' family members track down leads, speak to suspects, and search for answers in the CBC's hit cold case podcast, Someone Knows Something. Subscribe to SKS wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. During this time of quarantine, you may be running out of things to keep yourself entertained. Houses clean, closets sorted, and kids homeschooled. I mean, one can only sort the sock drawer so many times. Am I right? After all that is done, it's nice to take some time for yourself. So we're bringing back our book club, Unreserved Reads, the Self-Isolation Edition.
I wrote it as a short story, and it wanted to be more. So I wrote it as a play, and it wanted to be more. So it took me about 15 years to sort of think about it, deconstruct it, write it in my mind before I actually sat down and wrote it as a novel.
I really wanted to perform. I wanted to give it a shot. And I've lost so many jobs. I have no work in the foreseeable future. And so to have an option to be able to share your work still, that was incredible. Of course I was going to go for it. And if I was going to get a no, it was going to be no.
But when it came to issues and pictures and depictions of Native people, and Native people that were alive today, there was nothing.
Today on Unreserved, some must-reads by Indigenous authors and their book picks for your reading list. Kevin Millard is a journalist and law professor. He's also an award-winning children's author. His first book, Fry Bread, a Native American family story, won the Robert F. Siebert Medal for the most distinguished informational picture book for children in 2019. A few weeks ago, Kevin wrote a piece for the New York Times about testing positive for COVID-19. With a relatively mild case, he wrote about his 101-degree fever and being unable to get through a sentence without coughing. He also wrote about what it was like parenting from the other side of a closed door.
When they knew that, coronavirus was not just in the city, but on the other side of the door, nobody wanted to come in the room. But then they would come to the door and talk to me under the door, and I could hear them very loudly. So it was definitely a weird way of being a parent. But then now, I've been out of quarantine for a couple of weeks, and now we're all in the middle of homeschooling and 24/7. And I think it's made us all rethink what's important to us and what really matters in our lives.
For Millard, one of those important issues is representation, and it informs the wide range of work that he does. Kevin is African American and an enrolled member of the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. He joins me from his home in New York. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi.
I'm excited for this. This is cool.
So you already work as a journalist and a law professor. What made you decide to try writing a picture book? Did you have extra time on your hands, or?
I have a lot of different ideas that I like to share with people. I started off as an academic, focusing a lot on Native issues, on identity, on mixed racial and cultural identity. And then after being a professor for a while, I started to branch out into journalism. I started writing for the New York Times, which I still do now. Still writing on all the same issues, but for a larger audience. Because the people that I want to reach usually are not reading academic journals. And then also with children's books, it's the same topic, but just a different audience. And I like to think it's just an audience of short people, right? Children, parents that are paying attention to these different ideas that I have.
Now, this book seems perfectly suited to the time we're all living in right now. It's about food, it's about family, and as you said, identity. What's the story you're telling in Fry Bread?
This wonderful food that comes from a very dark place in Native culture and Native families' lives. So fry bread would have started out with the Diné people, the Navajos, in the southwest of the United States, who had their land taken away from them, and then they're displaced and they're forced to live in new places, right? So all of their land was stolen, people were killed, families were changed. There was so much darkness behind all of this. And not a lot of people that are reading things like Fry Bread for the first time know about this. Native families would know about this. Native children would be beginning to learn about what happened in previous generations. And Fry Bread is a great way to introduce this talk about what does expropriation mean? What are these lands and where are the lands where people used to live and why were they taken away? So then when people were moved to new places, they had to make do with what little they had. So all old foods that they would have known before, like the kind of things that they would hunt, the fruits, the vegetables that they would eat are all different now. So you could take like the Seminole people who started off in Florida, that had been ancestral lands for, hundreds, thousands of years. And that's in Florida. Florida's tropical. So after the Seminole Wars, removal occurred to Oklahoma. So all these people were forced to walk from Florida all the way to Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is a completely different climate than Florida. So imagine you have to, move to the moon. And what are you going to eat while you're on the moon, right? They don't have Whole Foods on the moon. They don't have supermarkets there. They don't have the same kind of soil, air. So then the government gave people commodities. And so what are these commodities that people are given? Flour, fat, sugar, other kinds of things that are, that don't expire. So Fry Bread was born from this story of survival, of resilience, of existence, continued existence. And now when we eat fry bread, I like to think of it as a communion of sorts, right? If you're a Christian and you have communion, or maybe even if you are Jewish and you celebrate Passover, you are doing these rituals and it reminds you of something that happened previous in time. And it's also a way for people to get together. It's all about community. So when people eat fry bread, because you always have to cook it for like 40 people, you can't just make a single serving of fry bread. It's impossible. So it's a coming together of loved ones, of friends, of new friends, and you're all sharing in this bread together. So it's like breaking bread as a unit of people coming together. And it's always fun. It smells really great. And then in a way, it reminds us whenever we eat this where we came from. And it also attests to the fact that we as Native people are still here and we haven't gone anywhere.
That is a complex history wrapped up in a seemingly simple food. Now, you have little children. How did they inspire you to write this book?
When my children were small, actually just my older son, who's 7 now, when he was born, I started looking for books. And, just like any parent, you're buying like Goodnight Moon. Like every parent in the world has heard of Goodnight Moon or they're going to read Goodnight Moon to their kids. But I wanted something that was a little more diverse, that spoke to their many heritages. And so I definitely wanted them to experience something, just my own children. This was long before I even thought about becoming an author of children's books. I just wanted them to see themselves in the picture. Their mother is Asian American, so we could find all kinds of Asian books. I mean, there aren't a lot, but there were definitely they were there. But when it came to issues and pictures and depictions of Native people and Native people that were alive today, there was nothing. I found one book from a tribe in the Midwest, and it was about babies, and I found that. I also found some books by Julie Flett, who's Canadian, who's Métis, and also by Cynthia Leidick Smith. But that is like 5 books out of thousands. And there is a group that researches the subject matter of children's books every year. So they've been doing this for about 20 years. And the numbers of diverse books that talk about non-white characters, it's less than like 10% of the entire children's book industry. If there are about 3,000 children's books that are published every year, the number has always hovered around 20 to 30 books, if that, that's on a good lucky year, out of 3,000. So that is less than 1/10 of 1% of all of the books that are published in the United States about Native Americans. So I thought, this is a travesty, and I'm just going to write my own book. I mean, I was pretty naive about it at first. And, so I went ahead and wrote this book, and I asked a friend how I would go about publishing this. And it all wonderfully, beautifully worked out.
Yes, and you've added to the small but growing pile of children's literature out there.
Absolutely.
So since so many people are spending more time at home than usual, we're asking all of our guests to choose one book recommendation for our listeners. What book are you reading, or what book are you reading with your kids these days?
That is so interesting that you say that, because I'm calling from my children's room right now, because they're all in the other room. So I'm in coronavirus quarantine, and they know not to come inside. But one book that is really beautiful right now that I've been reading with them is Rabbit and Motorbike. And it's just a beautifully illustrated book. And it's about a friendship, and it's about the cycle of life and what happens when your friends go away, and what is it that you learn from your friends. And it's such a touching book, and it was really wonderful to hear my 7-year-old son say to my partner, he brought the book to her. This was just yesterday, and he said, "I want you to read this book for when you are sad."
Aww.
So insightful, right? Because I guess they understand, what's going on now, how we all miss our friends, how we miss our regular lives. And then he was, doing this wonderful thing saying, here's literature, and this is something that can help you and make you feel better. And then I was like, oh, this is great. He understands books and the magic of what they can do.
Oh, and that's the best you can hope for. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Kevin.
Absolutely.
Kevin Millard is the author of Fry Bread. He spoke to me from his home in New York. Canada Performs is a new initiative launched by the National Arts Centre that brings musical performances to living rooms across the country. Last month, it was announced that Canada Performs is now open to writers as well, to give Canadian authors a chance to share their work and get paid for their performances. Zoe Roy is Dene Cree and Métis, and a poet from Peter Ballantine Cree Nation. She's the first Indigenous author to take part in the initiative. She gave an intimate poetry performance from her living room in Kingston earlier this month. Let's take a little listen.
I believe in the regenerative nature of this moment. I imagine the fish breathing like they're home for the holidays. The trees' branches stuck out like tongues on cotton candy. The sun dancing across the sky to slow jazz with a sad grin. The grass stretching out like it's already rained men. I imagine the stars crying happy tears as if they're hearing their language first spoke again. The mountains feeling cleansed, the rivers feeling 10, the groundhogs thinking they're magicians. I imagine bears stretching out as they do into each spring, the clouds becoming the fluff we drew when we were kids, that there are birds returning with new songs written, that penguins are gleaming at new sliding hills built, that we are all budding and will soon be ready to blossom. I imagine the pink moon knows that we all need to be cleansed, just like the earth and all of our relations.
That was Zoe Roy reading as part of the Canada Perform series, an online initiative launched by the National Arts Centre. Zoe joins me from Kingston. Welcome, Zoe.
Hello, hello.
First of all, how did you feel about your performance?
Oh, that was my first one, first live stream. I was so nervous going into it, and then I was there and I was in it. It was so fun.
Yeah, I got to watch it on your Facebook, and I loved it. I was cheering along.
It did feel like I was just performing for a room full of my buddies.
Well, you kind of were. So what was it like performing to your computer? Were you like all alone in your living room?
Well, I didn't really feel alone. If I focused too much on like who's watching, how many people are seeing me, how are they seeing me, then I would be so terrified. So I felt like just super chill.
Oh, that's good. I understand you do a little interesting thing when you're all alone there. You hang up photos of people?
Oh, yeah. So if you notice on the left-hand side where I was performing, there's like a wall. Those are all people that I'm like connected to. And then on the other wall, I have so many photos of like just people who are in my life, people who I care about, who care about me, and like just make me feel that I'm connected, that like, yes, I'm here, I'm isolated, but I'm not alone.
Oh, that's a beautiful thought. I might have to hang up some photos of my own.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Just know that people care about you. And you don't have to look at your phone to see the people that you're connected to, like real life photos that you can touch. And yeah, I think it's nice.
So why did you want to share your poetry online with people in this way?
Well, my mentor, Peter Hodgson, he suggested that I do it. And I really thought, like, I mean, I can try, but I'm probably going to get a no. But then I was like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? No? I really wanted to perform. I wanted to give it a shot. And I've lost so many jobs. I have no work in the foreseeable future. And that's insane to me because this is like literally what I depend on. And so to have like, you know, an option to be able to share your work still, that was incredible. Of course I was going to go for it. And if I was going to get a no, it was going to be no. But I was really lucky that they expanded their horizons, and I really appreciate the National Arts Centre.
Yeah, well, fortunately, they said yes, and you're able to share your beautiful spoken word poetry. So during this pandemic, how has writing and poetry helped you cope?
Oh, it's helped a lot. It needs some sort of release. Like, you can only go for so many walks. You can only watch so many series. Like, at the end of the day, you're still isolated. It has to go somewhere. It's so deep. There's so many parts of this pandemic that make you feel different things. Like, I'm worried about my immune system. Okay, Zoe, why are you worried about your immune system? Are you not taking care of yourself? Why are you not taking care of yourself? Are you too busy? What's important in life? That all needs to go somewhere. I'm a super deep person. And then I start worrying about my family, my friends, and people I care about. All of that has to go somewhere. So it's a way to keep me well.
That's a good strategy. Have you noticed that your writing has changed during this time?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time writing about lighthearted things. Everything is so deep. That full moon rocked me the other day. This is the cleansing moon. That's how I understand it. And I just felt like, yeah, it's no secret why I felt like I had to let everything out. But then now I'm so inspired by like the trees, the animals, the way the earth is regenerating right now is so inspiring to me. And so I just try to choose to focus on that.
For sure. Some epic poetry coming out of that, I imagine. Now, the other work that you're doing right now is your PhD student at York University. So you're probably reading a heck of a lot, but while stuck self-isolating, are you taking more time to read just for pleasure?
Well, I'm actually still in my studies, and one of the books that I read in a course was Dancing on a Turtle's Back by Leanne Simpson, and I've read her work in the past, but for some reason this book just has me so transfixed right now. Same with Maria Campbell's Half-Breed. She came out with a new edition recently, so I'm super into that. And I really like how Jessie Thistles from the Ashes has little tiny chapters. I like the little stories. And so that's super enjoyable. But when I read like Leanne or Jessie, I feel super inspired to write. And it gives me like fuel to write about things. And that's another thing to be grateful for, that we have these authors to read, that we have these voices. I like it.
And so you're not feeling as lonely as you might.
I'm not lonely for that reason, and these people are really smart and inspiring. I just feel really connected. Yeah.
Well, Zoe, thank you so much for your time today and sharing some of your poetry.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right, we'll talk soon. Bye now.
Okay. That was Zoe Roy, a poet from the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, who currently lives in Kingston. She was the first Indigenous writer to take part in the National Arts Centre's Canada Performs project. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today we're talking to Indigenous authors about their work and getting their suggestions to add to your reading list. And you can pretty much count on our next guest to always have a new project in the works. Ojibwe humorist Drew Hayden Taylor has written everything from essays to plays, novels to documentaries. The prolific writer has just been longlisted for the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor for his play, Cottages and Indians, the first time a play has been nominated. His latest novel, Chasing Painted Horses, is about the power of childhood imagination, art, and believing. Welcome, Drew.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, congratulations on being longlisted for the Leacock Medal for Humor for your play, Cottagers and Indians. What does this nomination mean to you?
It means a couple things. One, it's sort of an acknowledgement of power of theater, that theater can make you laugh and theater can take you places. It's also a recognition of the power of Indigenous humor. As I'm sure you know, I've devoted a good chunk of my professional career celebrating, exploring Indigenous humor, and the fact that this particular play was longlisted for the Stephen Leacock Award sort of shows that other people are appreciating our humor, not just Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Much of your work centers on humor. Why is that?
Because I think much of our life centers on humor. I've been to over 150 First Nations communities across Canada and the United States, and everywhere I've been greeted with a laugh and a joke. And that sort of, for me, defines our culture, who we are. We often use humor to deal with the problems of society. In fact, I think it was either Paula Gunn Allen or Leslie Marmon Silko, one of those two, who once said, sometimes you can best tell the most about a people by what makes them laugh. So what I try and do with my work is I try and, as I said before, explore and celebrate the Indigenous sense of humor. A lot of other First Nation writers are more interested in the more dysfunctional aspect of Native community, the problems that have sort of arisen from colonization. And I'm more interested in the healing aspect of humor, because it was an elder on the Blood Reserve who once told me that in his opinion for Native people, humor is the WD-40 of healing. Mm. Basically, for me, you cannot be Indigenous without having a good sense of humor.
Absolutely. We are hilarious people. And you, in fact, have a particular term that you like to use when it comes to the uniqueness of Indigenous people's humor. Post-colonial stress disorder, is it?
It's sort of the description of the sort of three themes that run through contemporary Indigenous literature. Basically, they're either victim narratives or they're historical narratives, or they deal with the byproducts of post-contact stress disorder. You know, you pick up a Native book or whatever, and it deals with something of that. It's usually something sad or angry or something like that. And it's dealing with what 500 years of colonization have done to Native people. So some people like to document that. I'm interested in going in and healing it.
You're a practitioner.
Well, I recently got an honorary doctorate, so just call me Dr. Drew.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your latest book, Chasing Painted Horses. What's that about?
It's basically the story of 4 young people on a reserve, kids 10, 11, 12 years old. And it's about the power of art. It's about believing. It's about responsibility. It's wanting to do something, but being told you can't do it. It's basically a story about the drawing of this magical horse on a wall and the power it has over these kids. And then, 20 years later, 30 years later, when one of them sees it again on a spray painted on a wall in downtown Toronto, and how it triggers that same sense of wonder, even for an adult. It's basically a story I came up with that wouldn't leave me alone. I wrote it as a short story, and it wanted to be more. So I wrote it as a play, and it wanted to be more. So it took me about 15 years to sort of think about it, deconstruct it, write it in my mind before I actually sat down and wrote it as a novel. And it's one of the things that when I reread it, either the short story or the play, it's one of the only things where I step back and go, wow, I wrote that.
And why do you think that this particular story stayed with you and demanded to be told in a bigger and bigger way, much like the horse in the book, demanded to be heard and seen?
Well, I think it's one of the things that for me as both a person and a writer, I was sort of developing layers as a writer of complexity where I wrote it in, I don't know what it was, 3,000-4,000 words. And then I wanted to see more of it. It was what I could do at that time. And then 10 years later, I wrote it as a play, which is how I could write it then. But now, as a jaded old writer of 57 years old, I thought basically, this is a novel. This is what I've been training most of my life to write. And I decided it was now the time to write it.
You're a very prolific writer, everything from essays to novels to plays to documentaries to everything in between. Do you have a favorite genre that you like to play in?
Well, humor. I love working with humor. In fact, I find it difficult not to incorporate humor into what I write. The interesting thing about the humor in the Indigenous community is the fact that it's a form of survival humor. When I say survival humor, basically it's humor that's been filtered through 500 years of colonization. And as a result, it can have a bit of a bite to it. They say Indigenous humor has 2 functions. It heals and it protects by being, for lack of a better term, barbed. Because survival humor is usually something that develops amongst people who have been at the bottom of the social hierarchy for a long time. And it's usually how those people react to the world around them. So survival humor is frequently politically incorrect because we're lashing out with our humor. But there's so many different other ways of exploring the Indigenous identity, and that is what is so fun and exciting these days. It used to be, as I said, those 3 specific narratives. Today, you have people writing science fiction. You have people writing horror. You have people doing murder mysteries, all these different types of stories that Native people didn't usually traditionally write, but now they're beginning to embrace and use them to document our journeys in this society, in this life.
So we're asking our guests to choose one book for our audiences so they can add that to their reading lists. What book do you recommend?
Well, because of late, I've been getting really involved in the world of Indigenous science fiction. I mean, I'm sure you know it's become really popular in Canada. You've got Wab Rice's Moon of the Crusted Snow. You've got Sherry Demerlain's The Marrow Thieves. And keeping along with that, showing the popularity of it and sort of the intrinsic wisdom that we sort of put into our science fiction, I'm actually going to pick an American book. I'm going to pick Rebecca Roanhorse's Trail of Lightning. It's an interesting book. She's Pueblo. Her husband is Navajo, and the book takes place on a Navajo reservation, post-apocalyptic, when the gods come back to the Navajo world, and it's fun and interesting.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Drew, and your suggestions.
No problem.
Drew Hayden Taylor is a humorist and storyteller from Curve Lake, Ontario. His latest novel is called Chasing Painted Horses. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. This week we're talking about books to read while self-isolating. A new book that the Unreserved team really loves is In My Own Moccasins by Dene Zah and Neheyu author Helen Knott. It's a harrowing story of how she overcame addiction and learned to face past trauma. The book is getting rave reviews. Helen joins me from Fort St. John, British Columbia. Welcome to the show, Helen.
Hi, Rosanna. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Now, your book touches on a lot of personal issues. You talk about your recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, and you recount past assaults, but you call your book a memoir of resilience, which I love. What do you hope people will take away from your story of resilience?
What I really hope is that the book finds its way into hands that need it, and that people can see parts of their stories reflected in that and find freedom in that space.
Was it difficult for you to share so much about yourself, so much deeply personal information about yourself in your book?
Yeah, I definitely have moments where I felt a little short of breath, like, oh my gosh, this is for real, this is happening. But every time I felt like that, I would just reroot myself in purpose. And once I did that, the nerves would calm back down. So I had my moments, and then I would have to ground again.
What were those moments like? What were you feeling fear and trepidation, or?
Yeah, there was one, and I think it was about 2 months before it came out. And I had a bit of a freak out, and I was like, I don't know if I should have done this. And it's like too late. And Kim Anderson, who is a phenomenal female Indigenous writer, she wrote the afterword for that book. I emailed her and she called me and she just kind of talked me down. And it was like, it's going to be okay. I know that this is going to help change lives. And really played that role of almost like auntie for me.
Now, in your book, you talk about growing up in a Christian household disconnected from your culture. Your parents didn't practice ceremony and in fact, rejected Indigenous medicines. But you reconnecting with your Indigenous cultures really helped you. How did culture help you in your healing?
Yeah, it came to a point where in order to get better, I had to embrace culture and ceremony. And it was a part of me that basically said, if you want to get better, you're going to have to try everything. And when I moved into that space and started using that within my everyday life and learning more and bringing that back into my family, everything started to change. And it took a really long time. It wasn't a fast process either. But within a few years, the next thing you know, my parents are going out and they're picking medicines and doing tobacco offerings and smudging. And when I would be out of sorts, my mom would be like, I think you need to go to the water, my girl. And it was just beautiful to see how that my healing journey brought that back into our family.
How did you find your way back to culture? Was there something that that guided you there or circumstance?
I think the curiosity was there. I think that sometimes I wasn't sure how to approach it. And growing up, you have to put in some work in order to access it. There was a main point, though, within my recovery where I ended up in Edmonton going to a peyote ceremony on a nearby res. And I think that was one of the biggest transitions, I think, in my journey. And going into that, finding that I guess the only way I can explain it is that there was this like constant buzzing around my head and I felt ungrounded and I couldn't even like sit still. It was just constantly going. And after I went to that ceremony the next day, it was like all of the busyness that surrounded me had calmed down and I was able to do the work that I needed to within my journey to continue.
You mentioned earlier that you eventually led your parents back to culture. How did you break them out of that Christian shell, I suppose, and open their eyes to culture?
I think I know it was a slower process. So I would smudge and then sometimes it would be like, oh, I'm just going to smudge right here. So on my maternal side, like I have memories of Grandpa using fungus for smudge. That was the one that he used. And telling these stories that I was learning to my mom too. And then eventually it was like, okay, you can, do this inside the house. Okay, I'll be around it. Okay, I'll smudge. So it was that slow progression within everything where it was like inch by inch by inch and having these conversations about what I was learning and pulling in the family in that way. And then my mom kind of took her own interest at the time, signed up for like medicine picking classes back in our community and started doing things like that on her own.
And how did it make you feel to see this returning with people that maybe weren't so open to it before?
I thought it was really beautiful to watch them within their journey and to embrace that, especially knowing where we had come from. And it's interesting because my dad will now talk about some of his family members that are still very much in that mindset and how they still have this fear almost when it comes to anything with traditional practices. And he's baffled sometimes, like, wow, it was really weird that I was in that mindset before, that's where I was at. It's just strange how much growth can take place over a number of years.
Is there a particular story that you can recall that would have illustrated this return to culture for you?
I can remember this was a number of years ago, and there was something that was happening in, I believe the community was called Elsipogtog in New Brunswick. And I remember feeling a little bit distraught by the news. And I was living in Merritt at the time. And my mom had moved to help me with my son while I was going to school. I was in my 4th year for my bachelor's program. And she said, you know what? Why don't we go down to the river and we'll, do an offering and we can smudge and pray together. And that was the first time that she had ever suggested that. And it was so bizarre. And I was like, oh, okay, like we can go do that. I remember going down to the water with my mom and doing that offering, and she prayed. What an amazing moment that was.
That's a beautiful image. Your mom has since passed on to the other side since then. How do you think she would see how it turned out, the success that your book has met and the rave reviews and so on?
Mama would have been happy. She always put in a lot of work for me. And even, like I said, she moved down with me so I could finish my 4th year in social work. And so for her, she put in a lot of sacrifices so that I could make something of myself. She always wanted more. And a part of me always wanting more was so that I would be able to give that back to her. Not necessarily having had made it to that place before she passed on, but knowing that she could see some of those things that happened, because she passed on 2 months after the release. So that was big for me. And I think within our family, it almost seems like every time someone passing away, there's usually a birth that follows. And so we've been blessed that way, because then there would be a death, but a birth would come and we could celebrate that new life. And this time that didn't happen. And I was looking at it and I was like, okay, well, maybe it's the book, maybe that's the new you have right now with the loss of your mom.
And such a beautiful birth it was with this book. Now, right now, as we're all social distancing and spending lots of time at home, a lot of us are turning to art, drama, and of course, books for comfort. What have you been reading?
I've been returning to some of my favorites because they give me some inspiration in regards to writing. So one is When Women Were Birds by Terry Tempest Williams. That one is like a long time favorite. And the other one is The Lonely Hearts Hotel by Heather O'Neill, who's the same author who wrote Lullabies for Little Criminals.
And when you say you have found inspiration, what has been inspirational about these particular books?
I find I'm often drawn to books that make me want to be a better writer. And there's some books as well that are an opening. Like they open me up further than where I'm at. And even though I've read, let's say, the When Women Were Birds, I've read it about 3 or 4 times already. When I go back, it feels like there's different parts that hit me differently because I'm at a different space in my journey. And that one has to do a lot with mothers. So that's probably why I gravitate towards that book right now. And the other one, it's a fiction. So it's more just about, I guess, the beauty within the writing.
Now, you were scheduled to present at the Festival of Literary Diversity in Brampton, Ontario, but because of COVID-19, they're now holding the festival online. How important is it that these festivals find new platforms so authors can continue to share their work?
I think it's so important. I know that I keep thinking about all of the authors too with their books coming out this year. And it's important to find new platforms and ways to connect during this process. Not only for the sake of connection, but also I think for supporting artists throughout that time.
How are you adjusting to this new way of sharing your work?
It's good. I think through this time, because I have more free time, I've been able to jump in like more classes. So I've been sitting in on classes and talking with people. Tomorrow I'm Zooming with a book club. So I'm using this time to connect with audiences that I normally wouldn't have because usually I'm a lot busier. And I kind of like that, to be able to explore what that connection looks like with readers.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Helen.
Thank you so much for having me, Rosanna.
Helen Knott is the author of In My Own Moccasins, a memoir of resilience. She joined me from Fort St. John, British Columbia. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. If you want to learn more or share any of the stories you heard on the show today, you can find them on our website at cbc.ca/unreserved, or find us on Facebook and Twitter. This episode was produced by Zoe Tennant, Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, and Anna Lazowski. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Agosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.